Yeah, I think that the more I think about it, the Crime and Punishment is fascinating because it combines the element of crime and punishment, redemption, Christianity, orthodoxy, how one finds alleviation from guilt in the midst of gigantic, huge philosophical zeitgeist, spirit of the time problems and issues that are coming up, philosophies, revolutionary philosophy, communism, utilitarianism, all these things come up in Crime and Punishment as well. And we have, did I say detective novel? It's like a detective novel that's also a Christian redemptive thing. It's weird. It's like it's all these different elements. I mean, I'm not trying to reduce it to like a detective novel, but we have a character, the detective Porphyria, I think is his name, and the story is basically this young guy who clearly is in some way, you know, Dostoevsky in the period of his life when he was, as we talked about earlier, the young idealistic nihilistic revolutionary who, although as Mark said, Dostoevsky wasn't himself atheist. This figure, this young nihilistic character, is an atheist for a while. He's this atheistic college guy. I think he's a former law student, and he's kind of just living in poverty and kind of just like being this lazy guy. And he hears this. I think he comes from a noble family for whatever reason. I don't remember. He's kind of living in poverty, but he overhears this conversation in a bar, and it's a discussion of great men. And who are the great men of history? And Napoleon comes up, and so he decides, as he from his atheistic perspective, it's like, well, if all I have is this life, then the best thing that I could hope for is to become a great man, to become a man of history, a world historical figure. And he rationalizes that those figures were murderers, right? I mean, Napoleon goes into war, there's millions of people dead. And he comes to this realization that the man of history is above morals. He's not bound by the morality of the common vulgar herd. This is straight out of Nietzsche, right? This is the idea that the Übermensch, beyond good and evil, he's not subject to the rules that everyone else is subject to. And Raskolnikov, this character, the main character, he kind of says, well, if that's what it takes, then I need to like own that, right? I need to own the idea of that's what it is to be a great man, and to act such that I am above morals. And he hatches this plot that he says, in order to do it, I need to find the worst people, right? And that way it would be more justified if I kill them. And so he hatches this plot to murder this woman who owns like a pawn shop, and he thinks that she's just totally lecherous, and she basically rips off the poor. And he's like, well, it's justified, right? I'm going to kill her. Means the ends justify the means. And then I will, I'll have money to then work towards my projects of becoming this great Napoleonic man. And of course that doesn't go very well, because the daughter of the pawnbroker woman comes home, and then he has to kill her. So he's this axe murderer, right? And at the same time, I'm not going to go into all the other characters of his sister and stuff like that, but basically, the story revolves around he's burdened of guilt for all this, for most of the novel, and he befriends the character who represents redemption to him, Sonia, who is also a prostitute that comes out of she lives in poverty. And this is relevant to the story of Dostoevsky in prison, because one thing that like literary critics and historians will bring up is that when Dostoevsky was in prison, he was exposed to the extremes of society, revolutionaries and intellectuals that had been put there who were, very high IQ and sophisticated, as well as petty crooks. And one thing that he seemed to latch onto was the idea that the more simple middle class peasant petty crook people were able to find redemption through confession and through Christianity, through orthodoxy, because they had a mechanism to deal with their guilt. And the atheistic rationalist intellectuals that were put into the prison camps could never find a way out of the prison of guilt. So the majority of this novel is about finding salvation from the prison of guilt. And so Raskolnikov doesn't realize that when he commits this heinous action, he's going to have to deal with it for the rest of the novel until he finds redemption. And so Sonia ends up representing the figure that always loves him and always comes to him throughout. She's the one that's visiting when he ends up in the labor camp, and she ends up being his salvation. He ends up going to bed with a Bible, right? This is very significant for him because he's this radical, you know, atheist Nietzschean wannabe, right? Ubermensch character, becomes a murderer, and he ends up at the end of the novel when Sonia comes and visits him. That's the last connection that he has with love and redemption, and she ends up converting him to Orthodoxy, you know, in a significant, serious way. There's a couple other things I want to mention. I'll hand it over to you guys because I'm sure Mark will pull out a lot of things that I don't recall or I'd looked over. But remember also socialism, communism, the revolutionary ideas of the time are present throughout this novel as well. You have the Western ideas that are being grappled with. And even within the character Raskolnikov himself, he's dealing with, do I want to accept the conclusions of Western rationalist atheist man and the nihilistic Ubermensch plan, or do I want to accept the older idea of that there is a God, there is a transcendent, I am bound by morals external to me, I have to live up to this moral code, and if I don't, I'm going to be burdened with guilt until I confess my sin, right? So basically that's what the essence of this novel. And so he keeps shifting back and forth. At times he wants to confess his crimes. And we can even see, this is even relevant to serial killers and the stuff that we've been covering lately with, you know, high profile crimes, elite deviants. Everybody knows about the fact that killers, oftentimes they want to go back to the scene of the crime. They want to confess. They want to do these things to signify and say, okay, this was actually me. And there's something about the human psyche that, you know, they want to do that. But at the same time, right, when he's confronted by the detective and he's about to confess, but then he's about to get off, because he thinks that the detective has figured him out, but he hasn't. And so he's about to try to get around it once again. And then Sonia comes in and she has a cross, and this, like, you know, triggers him. And then he finally confesses. And it's at the symbol of the cross, if I recall, that he finally confesses. And he is sentenced to 8 years, but it's this lenient, you know, penalty given what he had done. He murdered 2 people. But he's given this lenient penalty of 8 years in the labor camp. And then, you know, Sonia consistently visits him in the labor camp. And that's the final, she's his redemption. She's the one that shows him love. But particularly what I was thinking of, I think in terms of the demonic element, was that there's various phases when, after Raskolnikov has committed these heinous actions, that he kind of goes into these deliriums. Like, he has these phases where, like, he sleeps for 2 or 3 days and he doesn't know if he's awake or asleep. And he's in this delirium state. And there's even a discussion of seeing ghosts, right? Where it's like, that's probably, I think, where I was getting the idea of the demonic. And Mark, you can correct me if I'm misremembering that, but basically it's just that he is tortured by his guilt, and he represents Western man and Western man's atheism and nihilism, and that Western man will never find redemption until he admits that he's wrong and that he's in a way perpetuated and participated in these crimes, these ideological crimes, which are spiritual crimes, which will burden him until he finally goes to confession, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that was an awesome summary. I don't have much to add. You're right. Like his fever and his visions are the physical manifestation, yeah, basically, or the physiological, psychological manifestation of his guilt on the spiritual plane. So that, you know, it's that all those factors, spiritual, I
mean, is this him when he's, is this him, Dostoevsky, in the labor camp?
There's an element of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's an element.
I mean, he wasn't an atheist and he wasn't a murderer, but
yeah, but he did nonetheless.
He was around those type of
yeah,
people, right?
It's a composite, probably, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's this concept in Dostoevsky as well. It's like there is no private sin, right? Like in the at Tikhon's chapter, Tikhon says something, you know, forgive me, and he's like, for what? He's just like, for all things, you know, for all my sins, known and unknown, which is like in the Orthodox prayers, and Tikhon even says, like, there's no private sin. All our sins are everyone's sins.
Yeah, and that's kind of the that goes with the notion of fallen man and the interconnectedness of one human being to another. Yeah, there's it's an entire fabric of being that gets violated by sin. And so,
can you remind me who's the guy who's the one that causes the abuse to young people? I'm trying to remember what.
Oh, in Crime and Punishment, it's a guy named Svidri Gailov.
Yeah, and what was the purpose of that character's function in the novel? I just don't recall. Do you remember?
Yeah, I'd have to go back too. It's been a while since I read Crime and Punishment, but from what I remember, he was just kind of this deviant, predatory type who was looking to. I think he had something for Raskolnikov's sister.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
Dyer, from what I remember. Yeah.
So he's involved just because he's trying to. Wasn't Raskolnikov from a wealthy family, but for whatever reason they kind of ended up broke, and then he.
Yeah. Something. I think it had to do with his. It may have had to do with his father's death.
Yeah.
From what but he was. Yeah, he was living in this just like hole in the wall, like this miserable little apartment or something, and just his mind got spinning with notions of his own greatness and the notion of the Superman. And I mean, it wasn't phrased that way in the novel, but basically this man god.
Yeah, exactly.
That would carry over into demons and also into Brothers Karamazov in a way. Yeah. And also,
well, he mentions master slave morality and that like the great man is above slave morality, and because the detective Porfiry, he had found one of the papers, the essays and that's what kind of got him suspicious, was that he had found one of Raskolnikov's essays that he wrote about how the great man is not bound by morals and he can kill with impunity and he gets away with it, right?
It's amazing. I mean, this is, what is it, 20 years or something? It was like almost 20 years before Nietzsche was actually writing about these topics, right? I mean, this is 1866 in Crime and Punishment. Demons was 1872. It's, Dostoevsky expounded on like the Übermensch concept better than and before Nietzsche.
Yeah. What's awesome about that is that Dostoevsky and Nietzsche Nietzsche knew of Dostoevsky. I don't think Dostoevsky knew of Nietzsche. I would have to double check.
Well, Dostoevsky died in 1881 or 2.
Yeah.
And I mean, Thus Spoke Zarathustra was 1883.
Yeah.
Right.
And so Nietzsche knew about Dostoevsky. I think he might have read Crime and Punishment. I'm not.
Nietzsche said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist who could ever teach him anything. That's like
there's a good exactly. He was an amazing psychologist. There's a good book. Let's see. It was called The Drama of Atheist Humanism, which is in English, and it's by a French Jesuit. It's actually a very good book. The Drama of Atheist Humanism. Henry de Lubac, I think.
Henri de Lubac, who's he's a Catholic theologian.
Yeah, that doesn't like some of his other views, whatever. But he did a great job on that work, and it's very in depth. But the difference between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche was that Nietzsche, the abyss opened up before him, and he basically dove in. Dostoevsky went through the abyss, but he ultimately came back up. He reached towards heaven. He reached towards God, and he saw that Christ was salvation. Not and that and he put in his novels. He basically he ran the theory of the Superman and kind of charted out its logical consequences. And
that's exactly what Crime and Punishment is. There's multiple conversations about that master morality, slave morality, that, you know, beyond good and evil. So I think there's no doubt about that had to condition a lot of Nietzsche's thought.